less built, it's 0.99 in that regard. And in Paris, again, it's lower than that. And obviously, we get some measure of energy consumption. We don't get these three, we get those two, and we get them, really seriously different measures as well in terms of CO2 emissions. But that's because scale. I mean, we're talking about metropolitan region here. It's coming down on average at 0.33 per capita, whereas with Cambridge it's coming out in the current state, not in the redeveloped state, at 2.79 per capita, etc. But it isn't, anyway clean or resolute, the data sets that we have at present. But at least these are evidence of these indicators being operationalized, being tested out and generating data, which hopefully is consistent into a relationship between the inner city and the central core and the suburb, which is obviously lower density development, and obviously the city as a whole as well, which are also at different scales. So the more evidence that can be added to these case studies and similar case studies carried out, and that evidence base built up, the better. Because it's pretty slim at the moment in terms of existing city district indicator sets. This is obviously where we get beneath the headline of carbon emissions and try to understand other measures which enter into and obviously result in that expected headline. Okay, so a little bit less clean and not necessary than the previous set of indicators would suggest. Okay, are these indicators an exception then? Okay, obviously, sarà, BODEC, etc. suggest that they are, because they're not only dependent on simple measures, but instead founded on techniques of analysis that encompass the intrinsic complexity of the energy consumption and carbon emission, which is under investigation. Relate the fabric of city districts, neighbourhoods and blocks to the vital signs of sustainable development, and nurture also a dialogue-based investigative technique capable of leveraging the means to deliver on these particular savings benchmarks, carbon reduction targets regarding climate change, etc., etc. Okay. So, yes, I would agree with that fully, but as you see, the data isn't that clean at the moment, or that usable in terms of it providing a good, singular, clear message. So I would suggest, there are some weaknesses and fault lines in that emerging energetic, which is just, a default term, energetic, used for anything to do with measuring or trying to improve upon energy efficiency and also carbon emission. So, it may be surprising to learn during their expectations. It's not even the intrinsic complexities or dialogue-based investigative techniques these advocates of the urban morphology go on to investigate, okay, or they also seek to nurture. So something amiss here. Instead, every effort is put in being diagnostic and understanding the thermodynamic and constructural tendencies, ecology, exergy, entropy, and fractal geometry of the urban fabric, which is a different debate altogether, isn't it, the one we've been having so far on smart cities. But this is what the section of the academic community, particularly the scientific community, want to bring to the smart city debate, to lift it up, I suppose, into a truly scientific venture. Thermodynamics, so-called constructural tendencies, its underlying ecology, its exergy, its efficiency of energy, entropy, balancing the system, etc., transfer of energy, and fractal geometry, which underlies the urban fabric. They start with the most sort of complex challenge that the universe knows, from a scientific perspective anyway, and try to draw simplifications from that, rather than try to start with simple ambitions and end up with simple results in that regard. They see the city districts, these neighbourhood blocks, and the systems of indicators as a means to which we deliver on those, so we say, scientific technological expectations and use that to reverse the trends in terms of global warming, etc., etc. Because they're focusing as much on the relationship between the components as they are between the aggregate effect of that particular assembly or aggregation in that regard. Their warning is that there's as much danger in misunderstanding or not understanding the nature of the relationship between these components as there is in, bundling them together and adding them up and assuming that we can aggregate it to have this positive synergetic effect. So their message would be tread cautiously, try and be as light-footed as possible. Don't try and overreach yourself or run before into the wall. Those types of messages will be coming from their particular regional situation. So where are the structural weaknesses, etc., in this energetic? Let's see. They're indicators. We indicate line of geometry, urban morphology, as the built values of city districts. This is where a lot of intellectual capital is being invested in the moment in the new science in terms of geometry of cities, idea and form in that respect. What shape it takes, and how integrated or fractious that particular form is, and obviously relate what is the most efficient form and layout to the design, construction, operation and use. So there can be energy efficient and low carbon benchmarks can be set around this. The initiatives which have taken place so far, which we've headlined before, have not gone ahead on the basis of this thermodynamics or exergy or entropy reading of the situation. That science and technology isn't yet filtering down into the, shall we say, practical experiments which are going on to drive smart cities forward. That seems to be taking place in a big vacuum at the moment, and not a dialogue between one and the other in the manner which, obviously, Sarah and Gordon, etc., would prefer to see it. Perhaps in France, but if that's true, they're not sharing it with the rest of Europe yet. They fail to bottom out what these multi-scale cross-cutting techniques of analysis are in terms of what might be best diagnosed as the social fabric of the urban tissue. Okay. My argument, obviously, is that, okay, you can talk about form all you want, you can talk about geometry until, whenever, etc., etc. Well, that is still quite a very high level of abstraction, which is obviously mathematically based in that regard, and turns the whole of the system into an equation, or a set of algorithms, etc., etc., which is, in my opinion, runs the risk of repeating the same problem that we had with modernism. With modernism, it was reduced to an aesthetic, yes, which people then tried in the 70s to translate into an algorithm or a set of rules along that particular line. But now is sort of trying to be launched again, not as an aesthetic, but this time as an urban form, as a geometry, and as a sort of fractile analysis in that respect, to do the physics of that. And that would not have any purchase in terms of society in general. Yeah? Therefore, you might diagnose some shape or form, whether it aligns with the social fabric of this urban tissue is another question whatsoever. Is another question altogether, we should say. And the two may not simply equate one with the other. Misassign their causality by approximating the consumption of energy and emission of carbon with technical matters rather than social structures, underpinning the design, construction, operation, and use of the fabric. So again, who do we empower? Do we empower the scientists again to roll out some universal solution, which has failed dramatically in the past? Or do we trust society, to take on this particular visionary role and this particular obligation for designing through visions and through scenarios the future city which it wants to see in its name, rolled out in its name, as a social experience, in that regard, vital as a consequence of it being communal and it being intensely urban culture, etc., which obviously follows science and technological parameters, but isn't overly determined from in that regard. And the whole code isn't predicated upon a set of algorithms alone, but is a little bit more soft in terms of the systems, and is co-designed by members of society along with experts. And then that is put into some sort of program to meet expectations. The sort of algorithms and the geometry and all the rest of it, which the fractal analysis is working with at the moment, is really coarse. In that regard, it's very, very aggregated, very, very broad, and it doesn't translate into anything that we experience on a day-to-day basis. And therefore, I would think the question is leading in that respect too. Not only fails to verify relationships between the performance of the living tissue as to climate change, but also ecological integrity, equity needed for such a synoptic representation of well-being to be meaningful for those participating in such adjustments, which is basically the point that I tried to make a couple of minutes ago, but a lot better communicated in that particular statement. So if you want to perform on sustainable development grounds, you can't just rely upon one measure, a technical measure. It's got to be able to perform on ecological integrity, equity, and also participation measures as well. Okay. That's the lesson that we get from previous attempts in sustainable urban development. Never mind global warming and climate change as a solution to that particular aspiration. So, I suppose what I've suggested here is that this system of indicators, yes, is innovative, but it isn't yet sufficiently grounded in the social structures which we form part of, and trying to build and try to get digital technologies to actually support our particular needs and requirements, rather than the other way around, and get them completely on its head. So what's the critical synthesis then with these indicators? Obviously I've suggested that there is a critical synthesis going on. The only possible way to break free from this weakness and fault line, which currently surrounds the geometry of urban morphology, is to create a critical distance between overly determined physical centric diagnostics and focus on the social fabric of the urban tissue vital to sustainable development. So again, technical, social, sort of polemic there. User spaces this opens us to uncover relationships with underlying social needs and materialities of energy consumption have to the environment of city districts, neighbourhoods and blocks. Their ecological integrity and equity of the post-carbon economies, supporting climate change adaptation strategies that surface to benchmark the targets which this sets for those participating in such ventures. Okay? So rather than redesign the universe based upon thermodynamics, look more at the metabolics of the situation, which is, again, the battleground in the academic world. Be a little bit more sort of biological, biophysical about it, and understand the organic material nature, but in relationship to the social needs and materialities of the communities which are consuming those resources and emitting those public baths as a consequence of that consumption process, rather than just trying to redesign or re-engineer the city based upon some algorithms. I mean, SALA's solution at the moment is about diagnostics. It's about understanding, it's about the analytics, it's about getting the data, information, working out those measures, and then trying to compare them district by district or city by city. You can see what success we've had with that so far. It's pretty, small measure of gain. We can compare 4 or 5 particular case studies against each other And as a consequence, we don't move forward in terms of the critical insights they offer us. All we do is reflect back upon why they are giving us any direct messages, in terms of a straight line onto this, that, and the other. Why the chain of causality does not seem to be clear enough to show a clear line of reason, and therefore regression, action, and all the rest of it. What we get is an internal reflection within the community of academics about, oh, well, this, what does this mean, what does that mean, etc., etc. Trying to master, that particular technology seems a bit like fool's gold, in a way, or quicksilver, or whatever, or alchemy, because it just doesn't seem to break free of its own limitations, or its own expectations in terms of scientific tests, etc. Let's be a little bit more rough and ready, be a bit more pragmatic, and design the innovative indicator sets to meet the expectations of society, which isn't the same as the scientific community. There's people in that regard, and human beings like members of society in that respect. And let's then build in some measures which guard against any excess based upon this set of criteria. Is it equitable? Is it participant? Rather than does it meet the scientific tests in that regard? Because that one is an infinite regress in my experience anyway. So be wary of the indicator debate because if you take certain lines, it will take you back into an infinite regress, whereby you'll just get stuck in inertia because you do not have the means, data, information, or scientific power to progress forward. Try and deal across a bit more pragmatic. Okay, and obviously this is the indicator of the one planet living here. London currently needs 3 planets to live on, which obviously shows the absurdity of our particular urban system at the present time. Breaks down in terms of consumption, housing takes 24%, transport 17%, food 26%, goods 13%, blah blah blah. You can't, things can be simplified along these particular lines of measurement. These are very powerful indicators. What obviously, BedZen is trying to do in the Hackbridge project is bring London back into living on 1 planet. Because if we live on 3, then that means that Africa and Asia can only have 1/3 at the most. And therefore there's an inequitable balance in terms of resource access, quality of life between north and south within a given Earth resource base that we currently have. This way the messages become really powerful and transparent and immediately accessible. Trying to make an argument based on thermodynamics or exergy or entropy, you lose 99% of your potential audience in that regard because you've alienated them from the very outset. It might be a very high level debate, but you will not gain any purchase or any traction within society in arguing for innovations to take place on such a high level of science and technical ambition in that regard. That's my own experience anyway. And in many ways you could actually frustrate a lot of interesting innovations which should be going on in the meantime. Okay? So, a little bit more guarded that one, isn't it? In terms of success of what's going on at the moment. And yes, an innovative indicator system, urban indicator system is required, most definitely, but not necessarily on the basis of which is being promoted by the likes of sarà and Fording at this present time, I'd say. Something which is possibly a little bit softer and a little bit more easier to operationalise and work with in that regard. And that's what we try to do, with the research that we carried out in Hackbridge under the Urban Indicator Initiative. So, do you want me to rattle through that? Yes. Because then you can see whether this information is translated into something more transparent, and more immediately understandable, than possibly the exercise that Salah would have us launch ourselves into. Okay. Sustainable, and therefore doesn't need to make a distinction between what type of sustainability we're talking about here, because a fusion of them all, or integration of them, or whatever. But traditionally, when people have started to study sustainable development, they've always been quite specific about what type of sustainability they're actually trying to measure or achieve, and then provide a measure of their achievement in that regard. And it's either been environmental, well, traditionally it's been environmental, economic and social, yes, in that sort of relationship. And more recently, it's become environmental, social and economic, and even some people suggest, well, it should be social, environmental and economic. Well, the economic significance of sustainability seems to have shifted from the middle, the very east, to the outer extremity of the triad, shall we say. And in this one, we started off with the challenge of environmental sustainability and ended up finding out that we couldn't actually measure that without first understanding the social basis of that particular proposal. Okay, otherwise, you just ended up with tons of contradictions, which undermined the whole basis of the action. But let me, again, give too much away, too much of the plot before we start. The initiative was to achieve environmental sustainability from a major project which followed on from this better eco neighbourhood, which has been very, very successful, and extended that to the type of zero energy development into zero carbon, and therefore away from this singular development into the whole of the surrounding district through a retrofit proposal, and captured here by who are now entering a low carbon zone, etc., which became a definitive sort of planning concept, which was again sort of invented here within this particular area of London called Cambridge. Okay, so let's do an experiment. This is the area here, yes, the case study that we're looking at. So we're not reinventing, thermodynamics here, yeah. We're not going for any exergy theory or entropy theory. We're just looking at a case study, and seeing what significance lies in that as a practical, proposal to change the urban environment. So, of course, the first thing is, well, what area are we talking about? And obviously, Google map it and outline it using whatever open source again applications that are from Google to try and sift the area and build up information data sets, using intelligence which is already, or data sets and information which is in the public domain, which we can access freely and openly as intelligence to support and build the capacity, therefore, for interventions of this type, or alternatively, say, there's a gap here, and it should be open, and because we need this information, etc., etc. Okay, so that's just delineating the area we're looking at here. It is a suburban area of London. As you can see, it's really built up here. Here we're on the periphery of green space, we're on landscape, etc., etc. very high value and wants to be conserved and not built upon. This wants to change the landscape, visual areas. And again, it was just integrated this proposal into a master plan, so it was given some statutory basis that way. Became part of the One Plan. It's sort of an initiative. The great thing about this particular local authority or government is that it has adopted the One Planet Living Protocol as a means by which to deliver on its climate adaptation strategy, and therefore bear down 80%, or save 80% of emissions by making energy consumption more efficient in that regard. So it has signed up to, declared its support of the One Planet Living philosophy. Obviously, therefore, focus on the appropriate environmental upgrades, existing home retrofit, plus some new developments of environmental friendly homes, okay, which would be avoiding top level in terms of energy efficiency and in terms of carbon emissions. And the project was to cover energy use, waste and recycling, sustainable transport, low impact materials, food, water, inhabitants, local density, everything that is obviously in those previous initiatives we identified with the European Investment Bank. So again, this is one of the main standard areas of smart and sustainable city development. Okay, so what is One Planet Living? If everyone in the world lived like an average European, we would need 3 planets to live on. Obviously, it's technically impossible to do that. And to sustain life, over a period of time, to make it infinite in that respect. Initiative developed by Bioregional and the World Wildlife Fund, based upon 10 principles of sustainability. Top one, zero carbon, zero waste, sustainable transport, sustainable materials, local sustainable food, blah, 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 blah. So it has top 10, principles by which to develop and for people to live by. And if those principles are met, then we should be able to live on one planet. So again, it's saying that it's technically possible to do this. It's whether we have the conviction that's needed to actually experience that and see it as a beneficial, lifestyle choice in that respect. Okay, so One Planet Southern, this partnership between government and industry, again, universities feeding in, providing expertise like ourselves. So again, another example of this Helix model. Projects covering the 10 themes, transformation package and campus, sustainable suburb. Okay. Okay, so again, this is the transformation of the whole urban fabric. Here is focusing on the suburban locations. These are the highest consumer resources. Most inefficient way of organising life is through the process of suburbanisation. This is where you need 2 cars or 3 cars, and shopping centres are miles away, and specialisation means that resources can't be provided, they have to be centralised, and it's very expensive to then service the infrastructure requirements because everything is so dispersed. Therefore, if you can turn these particular suburban locations into something which is sustainable, then that means that you will have the potential to solve most of the urbanisation problem. And its worst, just its worst offence. It's in high consumption and emission rates by transforming the non-central locations into sustainable suburbs. Bioregional prepares a sustainable action plan, blah, blah, blah. To achieve this, some residents would need to reduce from an ecological footprint of 5.2 global hectares to 1.5, and from 11.17 tonnes of CO2 to 1.2 tonnes of CO2, which is roughly in line with what I said previously. But their immediate measure is the ecological footprint. They have a different basis of cardinal measure, if you like, for sustainability. And it's bringing it down from 5.3 global hectares, which is way above what the share should be of the Earth's state, coverage in terms of hectares of land to just 1.5. So again, quite a extensive reduction, but not the 80% sort of margin that we've used for the CO2 per capita statement. That's what it translates into, just a different measure to adopt, because ecological footprinting is more important to them, because obviously they're dealing with the Earth in its total extent, rather than the thermodynamics of an evolving universe. They see it as fixed and defined, rather than evolving. So a little bit more fundamental. So what does that mean? Okay, obviously the ecological footprint of that 5 in 2020, and that means 1.2 tons per capita emissions. And obviously it's represented there, obviously just in terms of a different index. And actually, in terms of tons of carbon, it's actually almost 90% saving. So it's again way above the 80% which Europe expects. But that's because, again, one planet never isn't using Europe's carbon footprint. Sorry, carbon footprinting logic, yes. It's actually using a different measure, which is ecological footprinting, which obviously one planet never suggests requires an 89% reduction to live within one planet. And as a consequence of living within one planet, have no effect upon climate, rather than just concerning themselves with climate change over time. There's a little bit more extensive a model as well, as you can see, because it works within the confines of the planet and the globe and the world, rather than climate change per se. Okay, so that's the extent of, again, the dramatic nature of the savings, which are efficiency gains, which are expected. The vision: elevate existing services into a district centre. So the district is going to be the unit by which we deliver on these particular savings by centralising services at one point, rather than people going all over the city to try and find them. Creating a strong demand for local facilities, again, getting people out of the cars, getting people committed to local district centres, neighbourhoods, and not necessarily, having a greater mobility space than that, because everything is provided locally. The saying we needed 1,100 new energy efficient dwellings. That was not allowed. That was actually turned down by the government plan for that. We're generating energy from renewable sources, power developments, as we've seen previously. Improving the energy efficiency of existing buildings. Cycling, pedestrian routes for transport, mobility, focal points for new employment, and raising the quality and image and identity of the area, so it becomes one of these, attractive new district settlements, which again we see as being the brave future for the urban environment. This will aim to reduce CO2 emissions by 20%. 2 years ago, almost, and now. How new buildings, existing buildings to be retrofitted to best practice energy efficiency and meeting the carbon trust, particularly refurbishment requirements. And that's really what we're going to focus on in the next 10 minutes or so. All right, so for our methodology, we were asked to oversee their particular retrofit program, to review it and see whether it did meet the expectations of climate change reduction targets, and whether it passed the test of good governance in that regard. So we were asked to do that, some sort of independent third party that would come in and verify or otherwise the legitimacy of the claims which were being made by Bioregional as an industrial concern about the prospects of the mass retrofit appraisal which was being carried out. So the first methodology was to develop an environmental profile, not necessarily drawing exclusively on their data sets, because obviously we wanted to measure it just on like for like. We wanted to see whether it could be cross-referenced and triangulated and be consistent with other data sets and information available to process, and yet still come out with the same results. So we developed this methodology for environmental profiling, source data from the master plan and energy options appraisal, which is basically a technical appraisal of the building types, and their energy consumption before and after the retrofit, therefore measuring the reduced energy and carbon emissions, and talking those over to see what aggregate effect that would have. We cross-referenced all this data which they generated by just using open source software and openly available information, and Google Maps, classify buildings, models, age, number of residential units, etc., etc. We've revisited this recently using GIS ArcGIS, yeah, and again, it's more accurate, but it's come up with the same findings. Again, it's an open source software system in that respect. But that's developed over the past 3 or 4 years. Again, just with voluntary data sets being, volunteered by people and uploaded into the system, and then being used as a means to check statements which have been made in the past. So these are supported by open source communities, which are evolving readily now and providing very valuable data and information, which again wasn't previously available from the government, but is now freely available from civil society, from people volunteering this information as part of ongoing experiments across Europe to produce mass data sets at no cost. Produced analysis of energy consumption and carbon emissions by building type and age, analyse the statements by conditions, etc. Okay. And this is how we obviously broke the footprint down by type of housing, etc., age, number of properties, percentage contribution, and all the rest of it. Now, the reason you have to do this is because obviously, buildings are different age, different design, different thermal capacities, different energy consumptions, and different carbon emissions, and that's based upon the legacy of the design. So here we don't get the privilege of having a blank piece of paper, do we, and just designing a new territory with, today's standards or even tomorrow's standards that we want to see emerge. Here we have to live with the legacy system, yes, and the limitations which it sets in terms of thermography and all the rest of it, lighting, heating, power, and re-engineer those existing systems to bring them up to the modern day standard, while maintaining the essential structure. Yeah? So keeping continuity, this is how we keep continuity, isn't it, within our built fabric, but retrofit in the new systems as scientific and technological advances, which can obviously lead to improvements in terms of energy consumption and carbon emissions. But we can't just, obviously we have to analyse each building to look at that particular capacity and see what extent the actual consumption is at the present time, and therefore what would we say as a consequence of certain services being bundled together to make a particular retrofit proposal. Okay. So what is it? B is 1918, obviously really bad offender in terms of energy consumption. In terms of energy consumption, and where's the post-2001 L, obviously better thermal standards, yes, and lower energy consumption. So you can't treat these as amorphous mass. Or if you treat them as an average, again, you lose, the richness of the tissue, which and the organic material nature of the entities which you're supposed to be working with. So it's a great example of, how not to live in the universal, but how to live in the defined, singular, and very specific, if not particular, entities of the environment that we're trying to be in. Okay, so that sort of thing takes a couple of weeks, to do as a sort of desktop exercise. You don't need a lot. You don't need any software really. You can just download it at no cost from Google as part of their Google Earth applications. And obviously, you can characterize it to show the different types, so we can do a bit more human and representable that way. And again, the message is diversity, isn't it? You're not dealing with the same type of subject in any way whatsoever. So don't expect average from the 1990s as you do from a 1890s type of development. Suburbs are very, very diverse structures, Well, in the UK anyway, I'm not quite sure whether this is the same case, mainly in Europe, but because we've always let competition rule and anything go, you get these very diverse land use structures in terms of suburbs. Okay, so 6 house types, pre-1918, main offenders, blah blah blah. 18% of housing stock is pre-1918. All the housing requires extensive costly legal work. 40% of the housing package is built post 1970. That's just a fact, yes. So that means that most of the measures that you have to retrofit will not have any bearing whatsoever on these particular buildings because they're already up to those standards. The technology will be able to progress beyond what they currently offer. Much of this already thermally efficient, blah blah blah, as I just said, double glazing might help. Only a relatively small proportion of existing housing stock will benefit fully from the implementation of the measures proposed in the energy options appraisal, which was done by engineers and players. And that means that you want to focus on the old, hard to treat pre-20th century buildings, because they can take a full range or list of improvements and upgrades by which to bring them up to this expectation of being energy efficient and almost carbon neutral. So you've got a large proportion of those houses will really make great gains, but they also make their own challenges in the process as well. Okay, so the social baseline, yes, why did we do this? We did this because the retrofit proposal said that as a consequence of the retrofit, nobody else would have made any better off or worse off. Yeah? There would be no winners or losers within this particular initiative. And therefore everybody would gain equally from the retrofit program being rolled out. So there was a sort of equity issue there, in the sense that when this retrofit proposal goes forward on these 2,500 houses, etc., then it will be beneficial to everybody, because it's an inclusive program, yeah? And it shares the benefits equally among the residents, etc., included in this particular footprint for the mass retrofit. So if that was the case, that would be quite good. That would be very clever. It would be a real innovation, because it would share the benefits of the retrofit equally among the residents as, in effect, participants in this particular project. So that was something that we wanted to explore further and see whether we could standardise that, given that, if proven true, would be a major achievement. So we also used again Google all these particular techniques. Yeah, just desktop exercises, break them down to certain areas with our statistical or social data sets in terms of who's rich and who's poor and who's middle income, etc., etc. And obviously again we get quite a diverse structure of income, income deprivation anyway, in the sense that this is about 25% was deprived in the UK, therefore poor, and they're resident up here. And obviously 2 are quite wealthy, 5 are very wealthy, and they're down there. So you've got a north-south divide in the footprint area for this particular suburb. But you've got a very diverse social structure as a consequence. So this is going to benefit everybody, this retrofit proposal, and it's going to cut across that structure and distribute the benefits evenly within that demographic. Yeah? And we're quite sure how we're going to do this, but if it did, then that would be a really significant achievement of retrofit. So it wouldn't just be material in terms of energy and carbon, but it would be social as well, in terms of wealth being distributed equally from the innovation which creates those gains. Okay, and this is measured the actual deprivation indices measured along these indexes here. So it's very good and very comprehensive. I don't know if you have something similar in Italy. I'm not quite sure, because when I ask this question, I get no responses from people in Europe. Whether you have any index as comprehensive as this, which measures households' in effect wealth or poverty, not just in terms of income and money, but in terms of access to employment, health, your health, your education, your subjection to crime, not just as a criminal, but as a victim of crime, obviously, and your living environment, and your internal building fabric, and how particularly well, sort of maintained that is, and therefore comfortable or otherwise the environment it is to live on. This is how the UK measures its official recognition of wealth and poverty along this particular index. So in terms of offering a fantastically rich data set to plunder, this is the one data set which cannot be ignored because it is so well populated. Okay, so we use this particular data set to identify the social and demographic structure of the footprint, and obviously it divides us so north south, as I said. Social deprivation is most significant in this area here, which falls within the 15 most income deprived in England. That means poverty, nothing less. Okay, extreme poverty in that regard for people living in this data zone. Doesn't matter whether you're in the social sector, or in the private sector, or in the rented sector. The majority of people in that sector are poor, and extremely poor relative to Sector 5 in this area here. But again, this is a fantastic, initiative, very, very bold, very, very high risk by original, because it is so diverse, and it is so rich in terms of its fabric. And if this can work, then it would solve the problem of the post-war state, which tried to segment everything along social grouping and enclave them in that regard. This would open them all up into a much richer, diverse ecosystem in that regard. So again, that's why this experiment was quite exciting from our point of view anyway. So what's the social baseline structure of tenure? As you can see, 4, much more social rented and private rented than rich. I said 4% down here, close to 51% there. As you probably expect it to be. But in terms of retrofit, that has quite significant implications. It's not just a fact. These are just picking up on environmental profile and structure of tenure in terms of emissions, etc. And we can see that the most affluent areas, which are down here, emit some of the highest levels, consume the most highest levels of energy, and also emit some of the highest level of carbon as well. Whereas the areas of number 1, etc., less so in terms of this gradient scale anyway. Obviously, the lighter zones in terms of energy, and hopefully also for emission of carbon. So you also immediately get an implicit sign here, aren't you? That the poorer you are, the less ecologically destructive you seem to be, and the less environmental damage you seem to commit. And therefore, the more energy saving and lower carbon emissions you generate as a member of that demographic. Okay. And therefore, the richer you are, the reverse, the more damage you do, because you have the means by which to be more destructive. But hopefully on that, that seems to be logical extension, doesn't it? So, a lot of issues to do with sustainability seem to be with middle and upper class culture and lifestyle and expectations as to a nice sustainable environment, warm, comfortable, just in the housing, never mind transportation or food or anything like that. This is just in terms of the built environment or domestic home in that regard, not your external relationships. Okay. All right, so that's what's obviously represented here, paraphrased here. Social deprived area 1, those consuming the least energy and emitting the least CO2. least socially deprived areas in reverse. In general, the older properties and high consumption energy emissions. In general, older properties privately owned or privately rented. Many of these older properties are unlikely to benefit from some of the initiatives that go forward for mass retrofit proposals. So what we are suggesting is, it's not the physical structure which may be the defining feature of a mass retrofit in terms of age of building, etc. It might actually be the demographic which is more important in that respect, because the division may be along the lines of rich and poor, rather than age and fabric and regard. Okay, so critical insights then that we obtained from this. Almost 1/3 of critical Hackbridge residents live in the top 15% of post-decline areas in England. The most income-deprived residents live in social rented dwellings, use less energy, emit less carbon than privately owned counterparts. Yet the regeneration plans for Hackbridge focus on achieving the maximum possible energy efficiency for all households. The homes required energy efficiency upgrades are older, privately rented, owner-occupied dwellings, and the most affluent in Hackbridge. This meant that the social rented housing was excluded from the actual retrofit proposal, okay, because they were energy efficient, okay, yes, in terms of the technical classification of what was inefficient and what was efficient, and therefore what could actually come within the definition of retrofit and what fell outside it and therefore was excluded in terms of incorporation into the overall programme. It was argued by regional and the government that the retrofit should, as a consequence of the efficiencies which were identified, exclude the social rented sector, because all the major problems were concentrated in, the older buildings which were seen to be in the private sector, owner-occupied, or within the private rented sector, etc., etc. And therefore, we should focus exclusively on the worst offenders in that regard. So then the question for us arose, well, does this mean that everybody within this footprint is being treated equally? Yes. You've already decided that we want to do an open systems-based analysis to understand the situation, but then based upon the outcomes of that finding, you want to be quite exclusive and say, well, we only want to focus our energies on this, this, and this, and therefore exclude the others, on the basis of a technical definition about what efficiency is in that regard. Okay? Because it was identified, again, just to drill down a bit further into the information, that the social rented housing, which obviously occupied by the most deprived, was the most energy efficient in that regard. It was already up to basically the top level classification in our national standards. So the question was whether it could be retrofitted to any additional benefit. Okay. But that isn't the same, for us, we argue, that isn't the same question about a technical limitation and a principle which said that nobody else was made worse off by somebody else being made better off. Because technically what we argue, put as a counterpoint towards excluding the social rented sector, was that, okay, you start with people who are, in particularly extreme poverty. They're already the most well behaved in terms of the environment. Yes, they're obviously contributing less than anybody else at this moment to the problem, which you are suggesting needs a solution. And then, based upon some technical definition, you exclude them from that solution. Yes. And leave them standing in exactly the same position as they were before you started. And then suggest that all the public money, which is being channeled into this particular mass retrofit proposal, should exclusively focus on on the owner-occupied and private rented sector. So their consumption rates, obviously diminish and emissions improve. They're actually, cost of energy reduces to them personally as households. Okay, they make a great social benefit to reduce carbon emissions. But on top of that, there's a green premium which they get, which is around about 15% of house prices, which are sold in the UK. If you've got a grade A certificate in terms of energy efficiency, then it's shown that you get an extra premium on top of what you normally expect for your house type of around about 10 to 15%. So how can you then reconcile that with the commitment that you made that nobody will be made worse off or better off? Because the social rented sector is standing exactly the same position as it was before you started. The best exemplars of how to lead an environmentally sustainable life. The worst offenders are being made a lot better off. Income-wise, because it's cheaper for them now to run their houses, less cost involved, and also they're getting social prestige value, symbolic value of not being bad offenders anymore, and not being stigmatised, and their house prices are increasing 10 to 15% on top of that. So it seems like there's a little bit of an imbalance here, whereby middle and upper income groups are being compensated for their bad behaviours. Am I wrong in suggesting that? That doesn't seem to sit, well with the initial assumption driving the retrofit proposal that nobody else will be made worse off or better off as a consequence of this particular initiative. That seems to be totally, counterintuitive and exact opposite situation of what the initial basis of the action would be in that regard. So then the big question came out, well, how do we get some returning equivalent back to the social rented sector? How do we balance those benefits back so that everybody's making equally better off in that regard? Because the demographics, once you drill down into the units of ownership, etc., show that that can't be the case if you go ahead with this proposal. Okay, it brings down emission levels, which everybody wants, which are essential to the overall success of the project. Otherwise, you'll never have an energy efficient or carbon zone. But it's asking the less well-off to, in effect, carry that particular program in a way which has no benefit to itself. So it's relying upon goodwill of that group to sustain the action which will benefit the middle to high income groups with much greater weight and significance than any benefits which they're getting. Now that's a social tension within sustainable development, and obviously, in that way, smart city development, which is a bit of a taboo at the moment. Yes, people don't want to open up that particular box. They want the science and the technology, and the to be overbearing in terms of rationale to drive it forward. But there is a possibility that if we're not careful, we're not fully diligent, many of these programs will actually widen the gap, between rich and poor, and accentuate that particular division. That division is obviously tense and fraught and fractious, and can very quickly spill over into public protest. You say that again, I don't want to overemphasize, but just exemplify the social revolutions that have gone on in North Africa, as a result of digital technology, and the viral spread of a particular incident or set of expectations, etc., through smartphones, etc. That the viral nature of that protest could quite easily surface, within mainland Europe as well. If these divisions are so deep now that they cannot be bridged mentally or physically or socially or economically or culturally, etc., etc. And these lower income groups have no investment in the future of a city because they're completely, sort of excluded from any such prospects in the future. Okay. How can you bind them in, these groups, into the future if you're not giving them anything to see as value, in return in that regard? When you do analysis of this mass retrofit proposal, that's exactly the message. They're bought into the programme to legitimate it in the first instance, and then as soon as you start to want to spend the money on actions, they disappear. They're no longer in the play. These characters have just disappeared, altogether. They've been written out of the whole strategy. And somehow we're supposed to be even more resilient and even more resourceful and say, okay, well, don't worry, we can, overcome this. We've got the ingenuity, we've got the innovation, we've got the means by which to weather this particular storm, alongside all the others which we've been expected to, fend off in the past. Okay. So that's why the final column of the European strategy says socially inclusive growth as well. But from some number of these initial experiments, it isn't an easy expectation to deliver on. And that's not just in Hatbridge, which is supposed to be one of the leaders of 80% and all the rest of it. It's exactly the same in the Royal Seaport in Stockholm. They're having the same challenge in terms of equity and therefore social mix and balance between their particular leading world-class proposal for Stockholm, as much as Hackbridge has for London as well. So that's one of the, again, social challenges which seems to be, a residual of attempts to be thermodynamic and constructive and all the rest of it falls under that. Okay, so there we go. Again, obviously I'm sure there's a much better representation of that particular experiment in the papers that we've published on it, in the journals, if you're particularly interested in trying to work through some of the technical challenges, but also some of the social challenges which mass retrofit proposals raise as well. And in mass retrofit proposals, those social challenges are quite acute because you are dealing with an existent incumbent community, a demographic which already exists. When you deal with new development sites, there is no community there. It's very easy to hide the social relationships because they're not in any way definitive. But with these types of experiments, which are trying to bring the city up to modern standards by maintaining the existing fabric and social structure as well, and not transform that in any radical way, they become quite acute in that regard. If anybody worked in regeneration proposals, which were again sort of the last decade's initiatives, again they surface quite acutely there. Will never go away within our system. There will always be a residual element which need to be safeguarded against any disruption or fragmentation. Okay, so I've gone on a lot, haven't I? It's 1:30 now, yes. So you know as much as I know now. So can I ask you just a simple question then, to give me some feedback before you ask me any specific questions that you may want to ask. Is this worthwhile knowing? As what I've said to you today through these 3 presentations, is that worthwhile knowing? I mean, has it been productive for you? Has it been, enlightening or whatever for me to share these experiences with you? Or is it not what you want to hear? You know what I mean? Because progress will only be made if we're all comfortable, with the messages that we're communicating, and you can see some prospect yourselves of progressing along particular lines of inquiry. I don't know if the message has got through. I don't think that the subject has to be alienating in any way whatsoever. You know, if you want it to be alienating, then go for the thermodynamic level, you know, sort of thing, or the metabolic level in that regard, and you'll not be able to talk to anybody about what you're doing. You know, so you'll not be able to share their experiences and build communities from the ground up that way. If you go for the governance dimension and you go for the participatory governance dimension, then we're all immediately enfranchised, you know, into that as a universal experience, you know, as being human beings in that regard, rather than the subjects of scientific and technological investigation. That way you can build capacity from the bottom up, you know, by you know, using simple techniques which are immediately transferable in terms of understanding and knowledge. They're not in any way simple, they are very complex, but at least they can be made, you know, to be understood and to be built upon that basis. So that I'm not quite sure what that would be called. Actually, I've never reflected on that particular position, but I mean, it's something which practice has taught me. You know, sort of thing. You want to talk to engineers and you want to talk to architects. Don't go for the high-level stuff. Go for the intermediate to low-level stuff, because that's where the majority or the mass of people exist, you know, and that's where you can make an intervention as a consequence. But what about any specific questions you want to ask me more? Have I completely drained all your mental faculties and energies and any semblance of interest in the subjects of time? Because some of you are researchers, aren't you? Or are they all gone? I was told that some of you are researchers rather than students.
We're both researchers.
All right. Students. Okay. So, what sort of projects are you working on yourself?
About some of us about indicators.
Yes.
Indicators.
Okay.
Some of them.
Yes.
Some other about resilience.
Resilience. Yes. So this. Yeah.
We are mixed up.
Okay. Well, that's okay. So with resilience, is that to do with external shocks to a system?
It involves the climate change
Yes.
like a sort of challenge.
Yes, and that's the sort of unpredictable.
Energy scarcity.
Yes.
Another kind of challenge.
Okay. So security and unpredictability of climatic conditions and all the rest. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I have a question about urban indicators.
Yes.
Because if I understand, you say that urban indicators should be easier for with the audience, adult audience.
Yes.
But if they are easier, they are not useful for designers
Yes.
or architects. So
Yeah.
we have to develop two kinds of urban indicators. One for designers
Yes.
and one for large audience.
Yeah. No, I understand the challenge which you're suggesting there. Is that the question? To some degree, I think yes, it is. But I think it's because the parameters of the subject are still not defined. Whether one is internal or one's external, one's for the public or one's for the experts, etc., etc. I think the headlines are still not properly defined. Obviously, Europe's question here was about, well, is it ecological footprinting? Is it hectares, global share of hectares, or is it just tons of carbon per capita, sort of thing. That was quite a big debate going on 5 years ago. There's a lot of, support for one and the other, but Europe came down on tons of capita per emission, in terms of carbon in that regard. So that's the headline figure that we can all work to, and is, immediately understandable by a 5-year-old. That doesn't matter what level of intelligence you've got. It's that straightforward. But I wouldn't say necessarily the question is about having one or the other. For me, it's this question about causality. Yes, this sort of causal chain. Okay. Because indicators, people just generate indicators, say, well, you know, I can look at a relationship between A and B, and, you know, it's a ratio, or is it something more meaningful than that? Does it evolve into an algorithm, you know, in terms of quite complex representation, or is it just a simple measure? So there are lots of ambiguities around what type of indicator and what degree of complexity there is in indicators as well. I think, well, the causal relationship, why are we using indicators? Yes. For what purpose do they serve? Is really, for me, the key thing. And then when you are trying to understand the causal chain, are the data sets there? You know, and is the information available to indicate something about that particular state, you know, at that current time, and therefore measure which it offers in that respect. And that's to most degree, that's a way of actually exploiting or leveraging existing data sets which are already in place, which a lot of them are redundant at the moment. Because, again, a lot of the headline indicators don't connect back to the data sources. They're not really transparent about that, and want to suggest that these somehow appear as something novel and new, when they're not. You know, like this index of deprivation, which the UK has, it was started in 1860, you know, and it's been built up since then. And it's around which the whole of our social structure and fabric and culture and economy symbolically represents, you know. But not many smart city designers or not many sustainable development analysts use that, you know, in any way whatsoever. And I have to ask myself, well, why? And the answer that I have to that is because they don't want to know. Sorry. They don't want to run the risk of being shown to be wrong. You know, they don't want to run that test. The indicator set has to run that test for you. It can't just be a headline which you wave around as a sort of legitimation, you know, for what you want to do. It has to have its payback. It has to tell you whether what you've done is positive or negative in that regard too. So that's a causal chain, you know, in terms of effect on a sort of quasi-experimental before and after logic. And for me, it's about assembling the indicators that can serve that particular purpose, rather than a global set of indicators, which is like a contingency plan for any eventuality that might just take place, you know, and which can be foreseen in that regard. I don't think we have that degree of foresight or wisdom. That's why we're stuck in the smart. You know, to be wise, we'd be in that stage if we were wise. We're not wise. We're just trying to be smart at the moment. So don't, again, overreach yourselves as a society based upon the science that we have. Does that make sense? Is that understandable, yeah? So I'd say, what's the problem you're trying to solve here? What data do you need? What information is available? Use that as a means to set your parameters for your project, and then use those as critical measures of cause and effect in that regard. Because the headlines won't do that for you. You might drive towards that, but that's got to be an outcome. But the means in which you assemble as experts to deliver on that will require different indicators, which you can't predetermine. Sorry. They're based upon the nature of the problem, which only becomes clear once you get close to it, you know, once you study it and get intimate with the nature of the challenge which it sets. So it's difficult to generalize in that regard. Okay? That's it. Time out.
For this long
the boss says.
For this long discussion.
Yes, sorry.